Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're happy you could join us. My name is Naya Hyde and I am the Marketing Assistant for K-12 Education Products here at Brooks Publishing. Before we start our presentation today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For the presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, you can just click the orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of the GoToWebinar control panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, we are recording this webinar, so everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in an email tomorrow. During today's presentation, Rebecca McCauley will reference content from Treatment of Autism Spectrum Disorder, Evidence-Based Intervention Strategies for Communication and Social Interactions, the second edition. To work effectively with individuals who have autism spectrum disorder, SLPs and other practitioners need in-depth knowledge on choosing and implementing interventions for communication and social challenges. The second edition of this best-selling textbook gives professionals the foundation they need to evaluate and compare today's widely used interventions and determine which ones will promote the best outcomes for the people they serve. To learn more about the book, you can visit the URL that is shown on your screen. I'm happy to also announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of Treatment of Autism Spectrum Disorder, Evidence-Based Intervention Strategies for Communication and Social Interactions, second edition. Winners will be randomly selected from today's live attendees and notified by email after the webinar. To increase your chances of winning, please be sure to submit your questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. Also, we did want to mention at the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey. We would love to know what you thought of today's webinar, and anyone who completes the survey will also be entered to win a free copy of the book. Everyone watching this webinar will be able to download a certificate of attendance. For those of you who are watching live, you may download your certificate from the handouts pane that is located in your GoToWebinar control panel. Live attendees, you will also be emailed your certificate in the next 24 hours. And for those of you who are watching this as a recording, be sure to tune in to the end of today's presentation to learn how you can access your certificate. Without further delay, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Rebecca J. McCauley is the professor in the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences at the Ohio State University. Her research and writing have focused on assessment and treatment of pediatric communication disorders with a special focus on speech sound disorders, including childhood apraxia of speech. She has authored or edited 7 books on these topics and co-authored a test designed to aid in the differential diagnosis of childhood apraxia of speech. She's also a co-editor for the Brooks Communication and Language series. Dr. McCauley is a fellow of the American Speech Language Hearing Association and has received honors of the association and has served 2 terms as an associate editor of the American Journal of Speech Language Pathology. Rebecca, we just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited for your presentation.
Naya, thank you so much. So right. I think you're handing things off to me.
I am. Here we go. I'm going to make you the presenter. You should be all set.
Fantastic. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today about this subject. It's a subject that I learned something about or more about when I began working on the final chapter that I was responsible for drafting of the new book that Patty Prelock and I edited, and that had wonderful authors who are very knowledgeable about different interventions. Well, one of the things I realized was that there are a great many and growing number of resources for individuals who have people in their family who have autism, who may have autism themselves, and for professionals who work with these individuals. So my objectives for today are to help you learn a little bit about how to evaluate websites for their likely accuracy and impartiality about ASD, that identify reliable online resources that families can use or share. And I think therefore those will be useful both to families who might be with us today, but also professionals who work with them. And then identify a few additional resources primarily for SLPs, but also for educators, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and physicians. And finally, I'll talk to you a little bit about how you might think about developing a search plan so you don't go down a rabbit hole and don't remember where you are and what you found out about already. Okay, evaluating information sources is certainly a hot topic in the world today. Knowing what to believe, who to believe, how to judge whether a source is likely to have ulterior motives or in fact be trying to meet your needs is a difficult one. In terms of websites as a source of information, they have many positive features about them. They present wide-ranging perspectives. They present information that's so accessible. As a parent in a study that was designed to look at how parents of children with autism are using the internet, a parent said something along the lines of, I can do this at night after the other kids are to bed, after things have calmed down, and I can look on the web. In addition, such resources are often pretty user-friendly. They are written sometimes with jargon, but often in a more friendly fashion that can help not just families who don't have a background in speech pathology, audiology, or other areas associated with communication disorders, but more generally as well. Those of us who are professionals can find this kind of a welcome relief. There's some drawbacks, however. First of all, these websites can be overwhelming in number, and I was really struck by that as I was preparing my chapter. There are so many websites with information that may or may not be helpful. Websites can be misleading or even untruthful, particularly where their intent is to try to get you to buy a product or buy an idea without much sense of how to weigh competing ideas in a very thoughtful way. And then there's little or no way to track information over time. So it's not like going back to a book or even looking through the references in a book to see how did this information come about. Websites are constantly changing, and in some ways that can be good, but it has its drawbacks as well. Now, in terms of domain types, they often are thought to be something of a give you a heads up as to whether or not these are websites that may have your best interest at heart. And we think of edu and .gov sites as being particularly valuable for a study that's been done looking at sources of information on the internet for autism. It's been done quite a few years ago, but nonetheless, those were the two they were willing to endorse. I've added organizations, but you're going to see I also think you sometimes have to be wary of those that have a .org domain, because sometimes you can be misled by those. So I list as more questionable .com websites and some of the .org websites. Hence, we need more information than just what is the domain type for a particular website. .com, clearly they're trying to sell you something, and while there may be higher standards held by some than other websites, I think you want to be really leery of those. So what might we think of when we think of website content? I've used the acronym CUTOR here. I've got a table that talks about characteristics you're looking for in the chapter, and I didn't use the acronym CUTOR, but I thought CUTOR is pretty memorable and maybe worth taking away. So I created this set of criteria based on a set of criteria that have been proposed for consumer health information called Discern, that's been used for a lot of different areas by some information from the NIH and also from a book by Rogers, Dawson, and Bismara. And you'll see those references at the end of this set of PowerPoints that you'll be receiving after this presentation is over. So what do I mean by CUTOR? Current, unbiased, trustworthy, evidence-based, and reasonable? Well, specifically, when you go to the website, can you find dates for specific sources of information contained in the website? And if you can, are they current? We know that there is a just booming amount of research that is coming our way every day in the area of autism. And so something that was true may no longer be highly regarded as an idea going forward. New ideas come along all the time. So we would like to say that you want to try as much as possible to find information that is current. You also want your information to be unbiased. Does the website present multiple points of view or identify possible options, or instead does it focus on a single point of view? That should be making you concerned that there's a bias there. In terms of trustworthiness, was the website created and is it maintained by an individual or organization that seems likely to have the best interests of the users at heart? And that's why I think some websites can be good, because there are philanthropic and parent advocacy groups such as Autism Speaks that have created websites that they hold themselves to very high standards for their content. And you can look at a website that you ultimately may think of as more trustworthy and find out who's behind this information, which you may not be able to do for websites that you should be much more leery of. Also, does it contain content that seems designed primarily to sell you a product assessment or treatment? Here you have to be concerned that that's the main reason this website exists. Evidence-based. If the website claims to be evidence-based, does it provide references to the research that's mentioned so that you can review any claims that are made from it? Does it provide more information from systematic research than from personal testimonies? We all know how attractive personal testimonies are, how impactful they can be. They can really make us go, wow, that's something worth looking into. And that can be true, but we know that there's a saying, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Well, similarly, you've met one person who's benefited from a particular intervention. That doesn't mean that there are more than that one out there. So you want some access to the basis for claims that are made to see, in fact, if it's based on systematic research. Now, some people will actually go and look up those references. I think it's a good idea to look up a couple to make sure you agree with the way they're interpreting the research on the website. But even if you don't, the very fact that they're making the effort to cite that information can be telling. Finally, the last characteristics is reasonable. Does the website discuss shorter and longer term risks as well as benefits of products and interventions? And in fact, this is rarely done. And the few studies that have been looking at the quality of websites, they find this risks are often not challenged or identified, and the longer term benefits may not be mentioned versus short term benefits. Are the described outcomes sensible or practical, or do they seem grandiose? How do they fit with what you're looking for is a piece of this. And also, does this sound a little bit too pie in the sky, or does this seem like, yes, I see how they might have this outcome? Okay, so moving right along to the sources of information that I want to share with you. I only have about 3 sources of information for families, and I avoided looking at Autism Speaks because I think everybody who knows about autism practically knows about that as a resource. Think about all the things that families are going to want to know about. Diagnosis, treatment, that's pretty obvious, but fitting into the community, what they as a family member can do, safety issues, how to help an individual with autism transition to adulthood and a person with autism may be interested in looking that up as well. Sleep. We know sleep problems are very common in autism, or even something as mundane as a haircut. If you have a child with sensory problems, you would really like to know, is there a way that I could try to find someone who is knowledgeable and has given haircuts to people with autism? And there are resources that will help you do that. And that would also be resources that could be shared with a person who's going to give those haircuts. So the first of the three sites I want to mention is actually a .com website, and I can't quite figure that out because it comes from a line of research done by Woods, Weatherby, and colleagues. These are well-known researchers in the area of autism and especially early indications of autism. They have published chapter 11 in this new book that's coming out that I helped edit. It includes many videos and downloadable documents about milestones of children's gestural and verbal communication development and interactions with objects. Since in those realms, gesture, verbal communication, and interactions with objects, there are clear patterns of differences that can begin to help us suspect that a child may have autism spectrum disorders. The website is also attractive to me because it can be approached by parents who are in very different places. It could be approached and useful to parents who are just curious about what to expect from perhaps their firstborn child. But it also reaches out to those who may be wondering, thinking something doesn't seem right here, and even those who say, no, I'm sure there's something very concerning here. Maybe they've even reached out to a professional and are in those early stages. This website just was one of the ones that blew my socks off in terms of materials that are available. Now I see time is moving along, but I do want us to visit just at least one of these websites, and I'll put it just up over here, and I think everybody can probably see it. And you do have to register for the different websites associated with this project. That's simply so that the people who run it know how many people are using it and for what purposes. Probably some of their funding depends on their having outcomes that they can show, like how many people took advantage of this. But in general, there are very few that are going to require payment from you or ask very many questions. I guess I can't tell what your privacy concerns will be, but I'd say take a look. I don't think you'll be concerned about sharing the information. So you can see videos that show specific methods being used. Let me take you to another website here that's part of the same group. Here's for looking at early signs of autism, and it gives you information such as red flags. I didn't get this, but it also will tell you things like 16 behaviors you should be seeing related to gestures, what you should be, checklist for 16 early signs. So they have signs that fall in all kinds of domains, interactions with objects, gestural communication, verbal communication, and they're just incredibly thorough. So I strongly urge you to take a look at those. And let me get this out of the way. The next source of a website is the Organization for Autism Research. This organization describes itself as having a singular focus on applied research and the quality and practical value of its resource materials of interest to people with ASD, their parents, and professionals. They have materials that are designed to facilitate elementary and middle school for children with autism, and they have guidebooks on various topics, including navigating the special education system, transition guide to adulthood, and even something so very specific as a guide for military families. Let's just quickly go to this website so you can get a quick taste of what that is like. Okay, so here are a list of, or visual of some of the kinds that are of materials that are available. The guide to safety. Here's a list of all the different guidebooks that they have in their series, as well as professional development issues for education. And also they have a sibling initiative that's to help siblings of people with autism. Okay, moving on, yet again, there is the National Autism Association, and they view their mission as responding to the most urgent needs of the autism community. In particular, they are interested in safety, abuse that can happen to children with autism, crisis prevention, and autism-related wandering prevention and response. So in relation to that, they have what they call the Big Red Safety Box. It's designed for parents, educators, and first responders. And we know from the popular press, if not from sad personal experience, that first responders are often bewildered and not necessarily as helpful as they would want to be when they are dealing with someone with autism. So here are some materials. They also have under Atrium, they have training resources that include recorded webinars, mostly for parents, but also for educators and first responders. Finally, they have a Give a Voice program, which provides communication devices for nonverbal and minimally verbal people with ASD. Now, I said finally, but in fact, each of these websites has a huge number of resources that you will be able to explore. Moving on to resources for speech-language pathologists. Training resources are of particular interest to us, but also research on subjects is valuable. Materials that we might share, parent resources, resources that we might share with colleagues, and challenging behaviors. And I list that because challenging behaviors are an area that often SLPs don't have a lot of training in, but that can be a challenge facing people with autism and their families, and with educators who are working with them. Now, the first of the websites I mentioned may be well known to the SLPs, and I hope it's well known to all the speech language pathologists who may be listening to this broadcast. But let me just bring it to your attention on the off chance that there's someone in the audience who isn't familiar. I will say that there is a big drawback to this resource in that ASHA membership is required to gain access to them, as far as I could tell. You know, it's kind of tricky once you're on the inside. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell, can a person who doesn't have that credential get that information? So evidence maps, they are on a variety of topics. They have one in autism, and they structure these so that you can find information in 3 different categories: scientific evidence, clinical expertise, and client perspectives. And these are all generally research. They may be position papers by organizations that aren't necessarily research-based, but you can find them in these different categories. They are pre-evaluated, meaning that the quality of the evidence has been graded by some knowledgeable individual as part of the posting of that information on the website. And they often make it possible for you to get direct access to the fundamental paper article that is being described, in addition to providing a summary. The practice portals are designed to be more user-friendly in the sense of they have a more informal style and many fewer references, and they address background, clinical roles, assessment, and treatment issues. So they represent a really good starting point for people who just kind of want to see, where does the profession seem to be landing on particular issues at this point in time. A website that many people might not be aware of is associated with a state organization that I found amazing when I moved here, and it's an autism center of the Ohio Center on Autism and Low Incidence Disorders. So it's serving a large population, but within that, it has this autism center that has a variety of online print and video resources, many of them designed for educational settings, but also for parents. And for example, they and others have information related to supporting people in the 2020 pandemic. And while much of that we hope is a thing of the past, things like hand washing and the value of hand washing and continued mask wearing, those may be with us for a while longer, and therefore there may be continuing value to those materials. But what really causes me to point you towards this is they have 48 modules that include online case studies, instructional videos, as well as pre and post assessments, glossary, and 24 of these 48 and growing number of modules are associated with evidence-based practices, so could help you learn more about an evidence-based practice. The modules themselves are available at no cost, but again, you have to sign up for them. There is a possibility of getting certificates for completion of some of these, and even for taking 4-credit courses online through Ashland University, which is a private university here in Columbus, Ohio. At this point, their CEU options are still in development. I'm not sure when those are going to come along, because in fact those have been in development for about a year since I started looking at these materials. And that's where you will access that information. Another resource is the National Professional Development Center on ASD, and there you can download a very thorough 140-page document that looks at and describes how they came to the conclusion of what constitutes different evidence-based practices for children, youth, and young adults. And it has them organized by target of the practice. And it's just a very rich resource if you want to learn more about what's going on. In addition, they have created for 27 of the practices identified there, 1.5 to 2 hour modules that are available through this link. And let's just go there very quickly to take a look. You do have to sign in, as you see there. You can get another COVID-19 toolkit. You can get these modules through this website. You can earn CEU credits, and they provide good guidance on selecting evidence-based practices. All right. 2 sources for educators. I've already mentioned some that are also valuable for parents and SLPs already, but the National Education Association has autism resources for teachers that include links to instructional methods, activities, and materials, as well as links to specialty publishers, and that's their link. The National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. This center is funded to support implementation of multi-tiered supports for social emotional competence, and it's for children with more diverse risk or actually identified developmental disabilities, not simply for children with autism. But they too have training modules, videos, visual support, scripted stories, forums, guides, and handouts that you might want to explore. And they're at an EDU site because it's been put together by the University of South Florida. Finally, in heading towards wrapping this up, I just didn't find many resources for this last three group: occupational therapists, pediatricians, and physical therapists. If you look at content in the Treatment of Autism book that's coming out in June, you will see that I have articles that are in various publications related to these sources, but to these professions. But in terms of online resources, what you see here is about what you will find out there, at least that I was able to find, in particular in my search for today's meeting. Okay, now that is a heap of information I've just shared with you, and that doesn't even begin to be the information that is available once you dive into the rabbit hole of any of those URLs that are going to be contained in the PDF that you're going to receive. So it seems to me that I wanted to end with some suggestions about kind of how to keep yourself from feeling just overwhelmed. And therefore, I'll end with a possible search strategy. First of all, in research or in this kind of a less formal search, you want to kind of remind yourself exactly what are you looking for. Is this an information you want? Is this information you want to use? Is this information that you want to share with a doctor who doesn't seem to be as informed as they should be, or share with a teacher, or share with another colleague? Why are you wanting this information, and what's the topic? And if there are several, well, you might want to consider, should I separate those into two separate searches? And then also, how exhaustive do you want to be? Because it's probably good to set limits on this. You can end up losing hours on a search, and maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to look for a really good single source, or compare 3 or 4 that actually seem to have some similar content to decide, do I want to kind of download information from 2 or just leave it at 1? Then you want to decide how to search. And it seems one way to search would be to search by these organizations that I've shared with you today. There are certainly others, but that might be a good place to start. And the reason I say this is because an obvious alternative would be to use a search engine like Google. And I'll tell you, in the course of planning for today, I did several searches of that kind, and I came up with things that are completely different than anything I found for today, but there's much more kind of wading through things to do that may not be necessary. In particular, I want to remind you that once you do a search, first of all, you'll want to keep a record. What terms did you use to look for information? Because it's probably to keep your content similar across sources, you probably want to use the same search terms or words that you're going to type into their search engine. And then you want to be critical of what comes up in your search. And this could include things like going more formally through this cuter set of criteria. Is it current, unbiased, trustworthy, evidence-based, and reasonable? If you go to discern, which is going to be the first of the references, you'll see they actually kind of, you have like a 5-point scale on questions that are related to these, not identical to these, to kind of help you weigh the quality of the search. But you can just do that more informally. But I also want to caution you, when you do your search, recall that those items that come up first are often paid for. So that the reason they're coming to the top of your search is because someone paid for them to do that. So that doesn't necessarily mean they're higher quality, that they're even more used. It means that somebody is really invested and you're looking at those in a way that you may not approve of. And then finally, keeping track of, well, what did you find? What seemed most helpful? And then, of course, downloading copies of materials and kind of trying to find a way to connect the materials you download to their source, if that's not clearly done on the materials themselves. So we're maybe in a pretty good shape here. When I practiced earlier, I was running quite a bit over. I'm not sure if we're there yet, but let's go ahead and stop. I'll just show you that there are references that you'll get. And now I think it's time for some questions. How are we doing?
Awesome. That was a great presentation. We got a lot of questions, so I'll be conscious of everyone's time, and we'll definitely go through a few. So someone asked,
I'll be glad to try to answer others. I can't promise that I will be able to do that, but if you want to send me the questions with people's, email addresses, I would be willing to do that.
okay, awesome. Thanks so much. So one of the first questions we got was, have you found that starting with information from healthcare professionals and specialists will help you define your search in general?
So, in fact, those people who have kind of really written, articles on the subject of searching for information say you want to use this information to augment what professionals say to you. So I definitely want to urge you to pay attention to the professionals you're working with. But I also have to say, I think it's completely possible that there would be information that you might find that would add to what they're telling you, and then they might even appreciate your sharing back with them.
What you found. That makes sense. Great response. You talked about a search plan. And we had a question about how long a search plan usually takes to develop, and should you use the same search plan every time?
Well, it's really funny that this question came up because I was thinking about trying to prepare a search plan, and I think it could really be quite simple. And in fact, now that this question's been asked, I'll try to come up with one. I don't think it would need to be exactly the same each time that you do a search, but yeah, honestly, one of the chief reasons I didn't go further with it was because I couldn't figure out how to make it look useful and a little bit nicer looking. But I'll give it a shot because it's a good question, and I do think it would be helpful if you try to give yourself a little search plan to kind of keep you from getting overwhelmed.
Right. That would be awesome. Are there any website suggestions you have that are appropriate for early intervention age children?
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of these websites that I think if you got to the website and you typed in early intervention, you might be led to those resources. I know I came across some. For example, I would say in those that have modules that are video modules, I'm pretty sure I've seen several modules, perhaps associated with the Ohio Ocali, the Autism Center, and also Affirm and AIM. Wait, AIM is the one that's associated with Ocali. Anyways, those that have modules, I think I've seen several modules on early intervention and autism.
Okay, awesome. And again, everyone, the presentation is in the handout pane, so if you want to just download it, you'll be able to access those links as well. Another question, if a website meets the CUTR criteria, is it reasonable to assume that the reference they cite are also reputable?
Yes. For those of you who have been exposed to evidence-based practice, I'll remind you, and for those who haven't, I'll tell you to remember that we tend to like peer refereed journals or peer-reviewed journals, because that means someone has tried to keep the author on their toes and really look at all the information that was relevant to answering the questions that they do. And so those kinds of websites tend to be best. For speech language pathology, the ASHA journals themselves, those that can be accessed by members of the association, have very good reputations. So seeing some references to their journals, language, speech, hearing services in the school, perspective different special interest groups and so on should make you more confident.
Okay, awesome. So definitely take a deeper look at that, everyone. And going along the lines of the previous question, someone asked if there are any websites you would suggest for Spanish-speaking parents or caregivers.
Here again, there are a number of these websites that have materials that are in Spanish, as well as English. And I can't, off the top of my head, it really has seemed to me that there's a need for, this kind of a presentation on steroids with, things like special audiences, because there are some websites that do have a lot of materials that are relevant for different language groups. I happened to be talking at a dissertation defense yesterday of a woman from the Somali community, and I know there's some of the materials that I looked at in the course of looking at the websites had like a little group of faces to help a child interpret their emotions, where you have these little face icons and then labels underneath them, and it was all in Somali. So it's well worth looking to find different languages that may be relevant to the clients you're working with or to your family.
Right, there's probably endless resources out there. It's just about going to search for them. So that's really awesome. I think we'll ask one more question and then we'll start wrapping it up. Can you give an example of systematic research and how those should be evaluated for validity?
Oh boy, that is a huge question. I teach a course in that, the master's program, but systematic research really is what you tend to see published in the research journals, and there are efforts made in the way the study is designed and interpreted to assure that chance is playing less of a role and that bias is reduced. Because one of the things that we know about human beings is we are horribly biased. Horribly biased, and it's, makes sense for us living long ago in a kind of earlier version of humanity, that you needed to kind of develop some fast ways of responding. But unfortunately, we tend to fool ourselves. For example, in studies looking at interventions, if you're helping someone, you desperately want to believe that you have helped them. And even if you haven't, you're likely to believe you have helped them. You put out the effort, therefore you expect to see positive results. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So in intervention research, there are a number of steps. For example, you've heard of randomized controlled trials. One of the things done there is to try to equalize the characteristics of people who get a treatment versus those who get another treatment or who get no treatment, so that whatever you see at the end isn't simply due to the fact that some people were kind of pre-selected because they seemed like they were going to easily respond to steps being taken on their behalf. But I'm trying to think of a good, actually, Asha, if you're an American Speech Language Hearing Association member and you can look at evidence-based practice, even going to the evidence maps, there's background information to help guide you through some of the thinking about, case studies have a place, but they're very close to being anecdotes. And then single subject designs have certain advantages and disadvantages to them. Group research has advantages. Systematic reviews are really reviews that try to compile results from a number of studies. If they are actually doing it in a statistical way, they're called meta-analyses. But if that's not possible, but you're still trying to kind of learn from a bunch of related research, that would be a systematic review, and that's considered a very high level of evidence.
Awesome. Very in-depth response. We really, really appreciate that. I know there's a lot more questions, but I do want to be conscious of everyone's time because it is 2:45. So we're going to wrap up the end of our presentation. Okay. Rebecca, do you mind going to the next slide for me?
Oh, not at all. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Just a reminder, everyone watching this webinar, you will be able to download a certificate of attendance. Everyone watching live can download their certificate from the handouts pane, and live attendees will also be emailed in the next 24 hours. We also do want to remind you that you will be prompted to complete a short survey at the conclusion of the presentation. We would love to know what you thought of the webinar, and anyone who completes the survey will be entered to win a free book. I'd also like to share that we are offering a 20% off discount on our products, including treatment of autism spectrum disorder, evidence-based intervention strategies for communication and social interactions, the second edition, through the end of the year. So anyone who watches this webinar can use, or the recording, can use the code COFFEE121 at checkout to use the discount. If you're looking for more professional development webinar opportunities over the coming weeks, be sure to visit the Brooks Publishing website for the latest additions to our Coffee Chat series. And for additional support, visit the link on your screen. On this page, you'll find a collection of recommended reading, downloadable resources, professional development webinars, and so much more from Brooks and other leading organizations. And one last reminder, everyone watching this webinar will be able to download the certificate of attendance. Those of you watching live, you can download it in your handout pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. Live attendees, you will also be emailed the certificate in the next 24 hours. And for those of you who are watching this as a recording, please follow the link on your screen to download your certificate. We just want to thank everyone who attended. We really appreciate you spending your time with us today. And thanks again to Rebecca McCauley for this great webinar.
And thank you all for your interest and your great questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.